Hello, I am that Weems guy here for first person safety. I had a question weighing on my mind, so I went to 4 individuals that I felt could help answer the question. That question is, what is the typical progression and experience level of a martial art instructor, so that there would be a basis to compare that to, what we're seeing in the firearms instructing world. So I went to 4 individuals who each has at least one black belt in a martial art and who are also experienced firearms instructors, so they could speak with authority from both fields. On a technical note, I am learning all of this video and audio editing stuff on the fly. These clips were recorded at different times using different pieces of technology, and I've tried to blend them together the best I can, but I'm just a guy in my kitchen that's doing all of this, so please keep that in mind. Also, on a content note, when Guy Schnitzler speaks to his firearms hours, he is only speaking of instructor level hours. He didn't go into his very vast history as a student of firearms before he became a firearms instructor. So keep that in mind as well. I hope that you find this information interesting, and let's roll.
So Chief Weems and I were talking about instructorship in the martial arts. And he was asking me, what's a typical time frame for somebody to become an instructor in the martial arts? And it's difficult to say something's typical in the martial arts because there is not a martial art, or it's very amorphous and nebulous because there's so many systems. We're talking about cultures and countries and literally thousands of systems and methodologies, all with their own ideas about how to do stuff. But there are some general commonalities, and one of those I think is the accepted approach to becoming an instructor. Most of the time, most systems, there's an expectation that you've been training in that system pretty diligently for years. Some might be shorter, but typically somewhere 5 to 10 years of regular training. And when I mean regular training, I'm talking about multiple times a week directly under the supervision, face to face, of an instructor, of a master in that system. And somewhere as you get years into it, you kind of move up the ranks. Well, not every system has like black belt. Some use different ranking systems. Some don't have much of a ranking system. But even the ones that there's not an outward ranking system, the guys who've been training for a while, they kind of take the role of senior students. And once you get to that level of senior student, generally you're asked to help teach. You're almost always, again, under the direct supervision of the head guy, the head instructor. But he might have you help out a class, or he might have you actually take over a beginner's class, but where he's constantly watching and monitoring. And that way he can kind of check, not only are you actually good in the system, but are you capable of getting information across, and do you truly understand it, or are you just a great athlete? Are you just physically really good and that you win fights or can demonstrate your superiority just by overwhelming somebody else? Or do you actually understand the technical aspects of your system? And so you have to put X amount of years, 3, 4, 5, probably at a minimum for most systems, to be an instructor, to start to get to that apprenticeship level, where you're allowed to teach a little bit as long as the head guy's watching. And you're going to be there for years. Again, probably another 3 to 5 years at a minimum before the head guy says, okay, you know what? You're an instructor. You can go teach my method, or you can go teach the methodology of this system. I trust you to do that. So from the time you walk in to the time you get to be an instructor in most martial arts, 5 to 10 years is probably a fairly reasonable timeline. But again, it's not just 5 or 10 years of doing it. It's 5 or 10 years of multiple times a week directly in front of the head guy. Then you graduate, however you want to say it. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's accepted that from your first day to getting a black belt is somewhere between 8 to 12 years on the average. But here's what's interesting. You're not necessarily, just because you're a black belt doesn't necessarily mean you're an instructor. Sometimes there are plenty of black belts who don't instruct, who just are good enough at doing what they're doing, but can't really teach it. So just because you have a level of performance in most martial arts, that in and of itself doesn't make you an instructor. There's that next step of, are you actually teaching? And do they know? Does the head guy know that you're teaching? And has he seen it? And does he accept it? And then you get that sort of that thumbs up. Short of that, in recent days, society is going in a way where, I want it now, daddy type thing. And then a lot of guys are getting certs. I'm not going to name the system, but there's a system, fairly well-known combative system where you basically can go for a weekend certification. And it's not my favorite thing. I don't really think you can learn anything that way in the martial arts. It's too hard. It's too complex, especially if you come into it with no background. But that's what it is. However, in general, there's still that general idea, 5 to 10-ish years probably before you can ever be thought of as an instructor. So I hope that makes sense to people.
Brian, would you please give us a rundown of what the typical evolution of a belt system is in martial arts and what it takes for someone to become an instructor in the martial arts world?
It's an interesting progress with martial arts because, we really have the beginner phase, which is unconscious incompetence. You really don't know what you don't know at that point. You are going to learn basic techniques. You're going to learn some etiquette of the room and how the rules are. You're going to learn how to do basic skills. You're very beginner of it. So everything is very simple for you as far as the technical skills, but it's also very overwhelming because there's a lot going on. You're trying to get a lot of new things put together. You have to learn offense and defensive techniques. And I'm kind of generalizing among all the arts now, but that beginner phase tends to last somewhere between, and this is a high number, but a year or two of beginner phase, which is a long time of training with people coming 2 or 3 times a week to train. And sometimes they train more than that. So that the time is not relevant as much as the mindful practices and how often they get in. But if we look at the numbers in a year, we're talking about a couple hundred hours of training under instruction plus a couple hundred hours of practice on our own. So that's the beginner level. When you get to the intermediate level, you've got the basic techniques. You understand that. You start putting them together in combinations. You start doing tactics, how this works against this. You start learning how to spar or roll. And you've been doing that before, but now it's really a big part of it. You start learning some fighting styles. You're at the conscious incompetence and conscious competence mode right now. If you really think about it, you can make everything work. And it's usually a pretty decent level of skill, a blue belt for jiu-jitsu, a mid-level for striking, where you can start to handle yourself. The techniques are coming more rapidly. You're making better decisions under pressure, and you start assisting a little bit now. You're not going to teach a class by yourself, but you are going to occasionally help somebody in the class that's lagging behind while the instructor supervises and gives you some pointers how to do it better. Here's what you need to work on. So you've kind of started working into apprentice mode right there as far as teaching skills go. When you get to that, and that's going to last anywhere from 2 years to 5 years or 6 years, depending on the progress and what type of art it is. When we get to the advanced level, where you're a brown belt or purple belt, you're really good. I mean, brown belts are as good as black belts. They just lack experience. You're working on strategy. You're unconsciously competent now. You're probably creative and adaptive with it, and you're probably doing a good deal of teaching. And there's people at that level that are actually running classes themselves. They may run a small gym, or they may run classes under the instructor, but they're constantly going back to the instructor for seminars and touch-ups, and they're having the instructor come in and watch them teach. And then the black belt level is a mastery level. So, you know, you're talking about somebody who's at the highest end of technical skill, but they've also had a lot of teaching experience, and they've probably had a couple hundred hours now of teaching other people and being understanding how the system works. They're also worried about the goals of promotion and how we make each client better, and how to work with different styles of clients and how to overcome problems in it. So they've got a real big difference. So you're talking about anywhere from 6 to 10 years in that situation, you know? So it's a long process with a very strong apprenticeship in it. It's very old school. It's almost like a guild, you know, joining a guild to teach.
Okay. Wow. Wow. Thank you for laying that out for us. That's been very consistent with what I'm finding. I've asked this question of numerous other people that I know that are in both the firearms and the martial arts world, and they're all laying out this same progression. So Brian, thank you for taking the time to lay that out. And real quick, your multiple black belts.
Taekwondo, jiu-jitsu, 2 styles of jiu-jitsu, judo, 2 styles of karate, and I have a teaching degree in Muay Thai too. So.
Okay. All right. So he knows from whence he speaks.
Yes.
All right. All right. Steve Moses is here from the Palisade Training Group out in the Dallas, Texas area. Steve, I know you're a big time firearms instructor, but tell everyone about your martial arts background.
Well, I have a relatively lengthy martial arts background. I earned a brown belt in Bushikan Jiu-Jitsu, a rather unknown type of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu back in college. After that, I took Taekwondo. I was a second degree black belt in Taekwondo. And this was the Taekwondo back in the days where we commonly went to the hospital or the urgent care unit afterwards because of the amount of contact that we delivered and sustained. And I recently, when I say recent, it's because of my advanced age. I say recent. That was like 10 years ago. I picked up on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Started taking Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Drew Arthur at Helson Gracie Jiu-Jitsu studio in Tyler, Texas. I was there for 8 years, during which time I earned a brown belt in Helson Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and I still take Jiu-Jitsu lessons to this day. I take private Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu lessons at Poland's MMA under just a great guy in Granbury, Texas. And one of the reasons I do the privates is because at this point, I'm completely interested in technique, and I'm less interested in grappling with an over-anxious blue belt that would like to submit a 67-year-old brown belt. You know, that's, you know, my suspension is pretty beat up at this point. So again, it's something that I've done for a long time. I also studied Filipino knife fighting under Charlie Porter in the Denton, Texas area. And I have a instructor certifications in empty hand knife defense and adaptive striking from Jerry Wetzel of Red Zone Management. As a matter of fact, we're hosting him this weekend for his ground fighting overview instructor course. And I've also got instructor certification under Point Driven Larry Lindemann on small impact weapons, which is SAPs and blackjacks, which I like.
All right. So in each of those martial arts, how long does it typically take someone, or what level of study does someone typically have where they go from the student to teacher?
Typically, it's a minimum of 2 years for many of the striking arts. My experience would be primarily with Taekwondo, although I think it may or be similar to some of the Japanese karate type styles or Okinawan karate type styles. So that's typically 2 years, and that's pushing it pretty hard in order to get a black belt. And by the time that you're a first degree black belt in Taekwondo, it's not uncommon for persons to start opening schools or actually just teaching under the head instructor, which is what I did when I was a first degree black belt. By the same token, you're teaching white belts, and you're teaching them a system in which there's very little repercussion if they don't learn the material correctly. That is, these are people that are learning just, basic stance, basic punches, basic blocks, and basic movements. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, about the earliest that I have seen Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors open schools has been typically purple belt. And in a lot of instances, those are purple belts that have been studying for 5 or 6 years and are second or third stripe purple belts. Very seldom will you see anybody with a lower rank, having a true instructor position. And when I say instructors, there's one thing about, okay, yeah, I'm an instructor at a school where my teacher has me do this class versus, okay, this is my organization, my business. I've hung out my shingle, and I am the go-to person here. So in terms of martial arts experience, I'm going to say minimum 2, maybe we'll just say 2 to 6 years. 2 to 6 years.
All right, but that's 2 to 6 years of training 2 to 3 times per week.
In 2 years, you're hitting it pretty hard, which means you're training 3 times a week, and that's for, 104 weeks. So when you think about that, that's probably going to be over 300 hours of instruction. And it's all linked together, which is something that is very difficult to do when it comes to firearms training. That is, get that same 300 hours in 2 years. Man, if you got time to do that, then and the money to do that, why are you teaching?
Right.
So it's very different. It's very different. And the other thing is, it's just like the stakes are so different in martial arts than they are when it comes to defensive firearms training. Because again, you're actually spending more time to teach something that is less likely to get you injured or killed or tied up in a lawsuit, change your life, get you incarcerated, make you go bankrupt. The opposite is true when we come to firearms training. And one of the things that concerns me is that every time that I teach a class, and I'm sure you feel the same way, is that you always want to make sure that you gave the people good information, it was correct information, it was lawful information, and it's nothing that's going to cause them problems in the future and potentially problems for you and me.
Right. All right. Well, Steve, thank you for your insights and thank you for your time tonight.
That's appreciated.
Hey everybody, this is Guy Schnitzler. Lee Weems and I were talking a couple weeks ago about martial arts and ranking systems and instructors in martial arts, and he asked me a couple questions. For the purpose of this video, just to give a little bit of my background, I have 3 black belts in 3 different systems. My first one was in Kempo Karate, actually Kanshin-ryu Kempo Karate. My second black belt is in Sansu Kung Fu, and my third one, which I was awarded last March by my professor Brad Scott and his professor Carlos Machado, is in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And Lee asked me a couple questions, asked me to answer them. The first question he asked me was, please describe to me a typical martial arts belt system and what level belt would one begin to teach. My answer was, well, in BJJ we start as a white belt, progresses to blue to purple to brown, then black. You get 4 stripes on your belt before the next belt level promotion, so approximately 4 to 6 months, depending on your coach and your system or your school academy, before you get striped up. It takes 4 stripes before you get your next belt. As far as teaching, and depending on your academy and your professors, some practitioners start teaching as a blue belt, and from there, under the guidance of a black belt or higher, they'll teach a fundamental type class. By that time in their training history, they've been regularly training 2 to 3 times a week for 2 years. So, we're talking someone who's training anywhere from 2 to 4.5 hours a week, depending on how long their class is of structure training a week. The next question is, Lee asked me, is I'm curious as to the level of study one has to have put in to teach a serious martial arts versus people being firearms instructor. Well, an average blue belt who's been training 2 to 3 times a week will have anywhere between 312 to 470 hours of structured training. And by the time he is promoted to his blue belt, it could be maybe a little less, maybe 300, could be more, depending on how long it takes his coach, professor to decide to rank him up and how well he's progressing in the system. That structured training is actual physical classes where he goes and trains. That doesn't count any informal training he or she does with their friends outside of classes, or any seminars, or any like open mats they would go to. So for someone who, is teaching a fundamentals basic level class at blue belt, they probably have about 400 hours minimum training compared to, some firearms instructor. I'm a firearm instructor with Range Master. I've attended both their instructor development course twice. I'm an advanced rated instructor under Range Master and a shotgun instructor, which puts me at 80 hours of firearms, just pistol and shotgun development alone for Range Master. For my agency, I am also a firearms instructor, and that was a 2-week 80-hour course which encompassed our pistol shooting and shotgun certifications as an instructor. So for me, I have 160 hours in firearms training between Range Master and my agency. As far as my Brazilian Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt goes, I have thousands of hour training. Right now, I train minimum of 2, if not 4 to 5 days, 6 days a week, an hour, 10 hour and a half at a time. So, someone who's teaching a fundamental levels class as a blue belt in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy, they're looking, like I said, probably about 4 to 470 hours of training. I hope this answers the questions for Lee and anybody else. If you have any more questions, want to get in touch with me, I am Guy Schnitzler, and I can be contacted at DFW Defensive Training on Facebook, or DFW Defensive on Instagram. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you to each of those guys for taking the time to provide valuable insight. I, for one, found it very enlightening because I was just not familiar with what goes on in the martial arts world. So I went to authorities on the subject to find out that answer. Perhaps this information will guide prospective instructor candidates to take a hard look as to whether or not they have, a commensurate level of experience, as to what a martial art instructor would have before they go down the pathway to becoming a firearms instructor. And if they don't, well, then now they know what they need to go do. If you are currently a firearms instructor and you use this and you take a hard look and you determine that you don't have enough experience, well, then you have an opportunity to go get that. More experience and knowledge is always a good thing. We should always be perpetual students. And again, thanks to those guys. I appreciate all my colleagues that are, participating with me on this journey and this show. And I was told by one of my buddies who is a professional podcaster that, at some point in time in each show, you should have a call to action. So, if you're enjoying this content, please, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the videos, share the videos. If you're enjoying the audio content, which is available on Spotify, Anchor, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, please share that with your friends too, and make sure you're subscribing to those feeds. And if they have reviews, give honest reviews. And I'm that Weems guy. This is First Person Safety. Thank you for your time.